Welcome back. The Transnational Villages Network is a grassroots organization driven by immigrants and powered by immigrants. Their mission is to champion complete inclusion and equitable access to rights for the 500,000 plus Indigenous immigrants residing in New York City. Here to tell us more is Transnational Villages Network social worker Regina Favela. Regina, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Now, can you just start by telling us a little bit more about the organization and its mission to advance cultural, social, and economic inclusion?
Of course. So we are a grassroots network of immigrant leaders and groups of immigrants and Indigenous folks from their countries of origin living in New York City. New York City is actually home to the largest urban population in the United States of folks that identify as First Natives, Indigenous peoples of the Americas, and so we are really hoping to be a platform for these communities to share in their language, their culture, and really be pioneers for the issues that are important to them and finding the solutions for those issues. So as a social worker, my role is in connecting folks to public benefits, supporting them in their applications, maintenance, and recertification of the benefits. But we're, of course, also working to connect folks with other resources in the communities that promote their health and well-being, and really trying to be an advocate for these populations.
Now, I think that it's so important, or something that stood out to me is the fact that it's people within the community helping others within that community. Can you just talk about the importance of having somebody who maybe shares your background be the one to help you, as opposed to maybe someone who doesn't know your experience, even though they may have good intentions, it just may be a little bit just of a more challenging experience to kind of deal with, especially like if you're living in a place like New York City.
Yeah, I think that's one of the greatest strengths that we have is really the knowledge of the community members that are willing to share that knowledge. A lot of folks have been here, for a long period of time and call New York their home, while some folks are newer to the South Bronx specifically, which is where we're located. And I think it's really important that they have found ways to navigate the systems in New York, whether that's the hospital systems, the court systems, the public benefits, and are sharing in that knowledge. And I think it's really critical, especially for a population that maybe doesn't have the same digital literacy or language skills. A lot of our folks don't speak English, and a lot of folks don't speak Spanish either. Their primary language might be an Indigenous language from their home country. So really having a community of people that care about you and also know your language and your culture and can share in that experience is really vital. We have a group of interpreters that are providing those language services that are so vital to accessing resources and can share in that knowledge and build that strength. And like as you mentioned, that representation is so important because they understand where the community members are coming from and are able to help them navigate those systems in ways that outsiders might not know, especially with that cultural component that is so key.
Now, one key approach is transnational organizing. Could you explain what this means and how it empowers Indigenous immigrant communities to address challenges in New York City?
So for us, transnational means working in both the U.S., in the New York City context, and in the tri-state area, but also working in Mexico, where a lot of our folks are coming from. So we have a lot of partnerships that are working with individuals and agencies that are in Mexico and also in other countries of origin, including Honduras, Guatemala, Ecuador, across the Americas. And that's really vital because the people that we're working with in these countries have either lived experience themselves identifying as Indigenous or as from these communities, or have expertise and knowledge in working with these communities. So by creating these networks, these transnational avenues of communication, we're really able to harness that knowledge that exists there and bring that to our communities and also share what we know of the US systems across as well. And so that has really helped straighten our programming, where we're able to bring in that knowledge either through Zoom calls or through our weekly meetings that we have, bringing that knowledge here and making sure that we're still staying connected to our culture from our home countries, even though we're living in New York, and really strengthening that partnership.
Now, I want to touch on that a little bit more because being culturally competent is so important. And I think a lot of organizations, although they mean well, sometimes they think like one size fits all for a lot of groups of people who are maybe experiencing a lot of challenges, whether they are from an immigrant background or maybe they're just, maybe they're possibly low income, maybe they just have some, thing that they're dealing with. Can you just talk about the importance of being culturally competent and offering services that kind of highlight that?
Yeah, so something that we say is it's really hard to be competent in another person's culture, right? So we talk about cultural humility and really making sure to honor that person's culture and letting them use their own words and how they express themselves in what they think and feel about their culture, because every person will experience that culture differently. So really wanting to bring awareness to that point, and highlight that that experience is unique to each individual. But of course, knowing that culturally relevant and appropriate ways of handling mental health or physical health care, or in how to navigate these systems, is really vital so that folks feel comfortable accessing these systems and staying enrolled in systems, in services. So for us, it really means going to our community members and learning from them about their experiences and how to bring that into the work, and being sure that we're constantly going to them for that information, and being sure that we are including them in all decision making. One of the things that it does really well is think about decision making as a collective enterprise. So we're always working with the community members to vote on the different issues that are coming up, especially in our programming for the later year, thinking about including them in how the organization functions and how the organization moves forward, and being sure that that piece of that cultural piece is so important and relevant, but also making sure, right, that we're not that we're understanding it from each individual perspective. I think another thing that we do is using an organizing model that comes from a lot of these Indigenous backgrounds and ways of organizing. So folks form committees that they can vote on the governance of that committee, to highlight different issues that are impacting them and finding ways to solve those issues. So I think that's a really vital piece, because they themselves are organizing, and as community members, as particular people of a particular culture and language, to work forward and kind of really build out La Red as an organization.
Now, I'm curious to know what role, well, first you can explain, is there space, or, do first generation, maybe children, like, are they a part of this organization as well, whether they're working with some of the families or they're a part of the families? And how do you guys just address, their presence there? Because I could imagine for them, it's also this mixed feeling of like, okay, this is my home and this is where I'm from, but I also have this other culture. And how do you acknowledge that when you are working with those types of families?
Yes, I think a lot of our families are mixed families, where we have children that are born here in the U.S., and that is definitely an experience that I also share, as both of my parents are immigrants from Mexico, so that kind of informs the way I move in the world. But for our members, we do a lot of work around cultural transmission, either of language or practices. We have a collective called Voces, which is primarily made up of women that work with their children to pass on their language, their food, different aspects of their culture that they find important to them, that they want their children to know being raised here in the U.S. We also have another group called Arte y Pintura, like art and paint, that is with women and their children, that they can come in and learn arts and crafts that are from their home countries, and really share in that practice, which is really working with your hands and being creative in a space that is often, especially New York, is moving and really rushed. So that's really beautiful to see, and then really bringing in the children when we can. So some of our programming is more geared towards adults, but we also really try to include children to learn about their culture, and to really embrace that and feel that, and kind of knowing that as well, that they're growing up in New York, and that brings different challenges. So really trying to work with the family as a whole to address that when there might be either tension of growing up in a different culture than your parents, or addressing other barriers that may exist, especially with the education system and the court systems, if children find themselves having challenges in those spaces.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because, just having this conversation now, I just thought about it, like, I think sometimes we often just think of the adults, which obviously they have so much to deal with, so it is important that we focus on them, but I'm like, I wonder how the first generation children are also dealing with this, and how they navigate that. As somebody who's also first generation, my dad is from the Caribbean, I think about like, yeah, how do you actually stay connected to your culture? And I think that although this work is important, when we're talking about anything that's dealing with like legal stuff, all that stuff is important, but I think like kind of staying true to your culture is also very important. Would you say that's part of like, the mission, or like helping these communities advance socially, culturally? Does that help, when you involve the children as well?
I think so. I think it straightens the family unit as a whole, right? When you can see yourself also reflected in your children and your parents kind of coming together in that same culture, and it really brings about a strength and an empowerment, which I think is so vital, especially when we're seeing, across the U.S., just racism and discrimination, how if really harnessing a cultural identity can be such a strengthening power. And part of like the resilience of children, the resilience growing up here in the U.S. I think that's really important in kind of navigating these systems. And then you're also creating another sort of generation legacy for this work to continue, right? Which is really important, is that continual work.
Now, one activity is the annual School for Life, Health, and Justice. Can you tell me a little bit more about the initiative and how it benefits the Indigenous immigrant community?
Sure. So that is our annual school that happens over the summer. So folks at the beginning of the year will vote on different topics that are of interest to them. So this year, for example, we had a workshop on domestic violence. We also had a workshop on public benefits. We had a workshop on traditional foods, and we'll bring in presenters either that are in Mexico or in other countries via Zoom, or we'll have partnerships with different organizations in the city, or kind of bringing out a leader in the community that can speak to that topic, and then sharing that information. So one of the things that we really strive for is access to information, and making sure that that information is accessible in the language that people speak, that is coming from people that are trusted from the community, and really making sure that we're addressing those barriers to information that often exist. So really trying to find ways to bring that information to the community in our community space that people already feel comfortable in and familiar in, and where they can feel free to ask questions and share. It also usually ends with food, so folks are always coming in to share, which is where even more questions spring up as they're digesting their food and thinking about the information that was shared, which is really important. And then it always ends with a certification, so folks get a certificate for participating in the event, and if the children were participants as well, so for certain topics, they can also receive that.
That sounds amazing. Now, I want to talk about your organization's overall goal, where you envision cities that all communities are welcome, included, and represented, regardless of their immigration status. What are some specific challenges that Indigenous immigrant communities face in achieving this vision? And I also want to focus on the fact that, what are some of the challenges that they face in New York? Because I know that if you're from New York, obviously it's a great city and we're all lucky to be here. But I think people sometimes think that, it's kind of a utopia because there's so many different cultures and backgrounds that you may not see the same challenges that we may see in different parts of the country. But what is that experience like, especially in New York City?
Mm-hmm. So I think there's definitely challenges. I think New York City is a really welcoming city in a lot of ways, but I think one of the challenges that we've witnessed is that a lot of folks, as I mentioned earlier, don't speak Spanish or don't speak English, so really having difficulty navigating the city that's really foreign to them and in a different language, I think can be a big barrier to that experience. I think we are also experiencing a lot of shifts in different policies that can really impact how people view themselves and communicate with one another. I think one of the challenges that we faced is just a lot of myths about either accessing public benefits or accessing other resources in the city of if you ask for help here, that might impact you in this way or might impact your children in the future, and really trying to dismantle some of those myths that exist and that are very easily shared online, and really trying to bring back in that information that is true information to make sure that people feel comfortable. It also means opening up other avenues where people can feel confident in sharing about themselves and sharing their culture and fully embracing that. I think a lot of times that can be challenging because of racism and because of discrimination. Folks might try to hide different aspects of themselves as a self-protection, but really trying to find spaces where that doesn't have to happen, and our cultural spaces being one of those, our location in the Bronx, and really trying to be that welcoming environment and trying to find ways to change the policies that are restrictive, that are limiting, and really impacting the well-being of our community members.
And I know you mentioned that language barriers can be a challenge. Is that associated in any way with language justice? Can you tell me a little bit more about what that is and how your organization works towards that?
Mm-hmm. So for us, we have a committee of El Colibri, which is our interpreters collective. We also have Voces that does interpretation work and transmission of language. And that for us is having interpreters that can speak indigenous languages in different spaces that folks might be navigating. So that could either be in a healthcare setting. We know that a lot of our members might not have either health insurance or a primary care doctor. So what does it mean to have an interpreter available for those visits to really make sure that they're accessing the care that they need? Also in education settings, if parents are trying to enroll their children, that can be a big challenge if there isn't someone that speaks their same language. It means being able to use their language and having the forms that are available to them, having interviews that might be necessary to access public benefits be available to them in their language, or having an interpreter that's available. We know that interpretation is a right, but often that's not in the language that they need. It might be provided in Spanish, but that's not adequate for our population that speaks so many different languages from the different countries of origin.
And I kind of want to expand on that a little bit more, just talking about health, because it's something that I never really thought of previously. How do these language barriers affect so many communities in regard to health and well-being? Do they possibly not feel comfortable maybe going to their doctor if their doctor doesn't speak the same language, or is there like a disconnect if you have a translator there? Can you just talk about what that experience is like in terms of health and well-being?
I think it can create a barrier to either accessing a public, to accessing a primary care doctor, or accessing health insurance. If you don't have health insurance, it can be really difficult to pay out of pocket for medical expenses. So that's definitely one thing we're seeing. And the enrollment process for health insurance is really confusing. There's also income eligibility, there's also immigration eligibility, and all of that creates additional barriers where folks might not know that they're eligible and might remain uninsured. And then with accessing a doctor, you can just think about when you enter a doctor's office, how many forms you have to fill out, and if there isn't any assistance to fill that out, that can really be an unwelcoming environment. I think a lot of these spaces are doing what they can, but I think it's often really difficult for folks to navigate that if they don't have someone that speaks their same language or can understand how they're expressing even the symptoms that they're feeling, right? Of like the way that someone might feel a particular pain, or thinking about like trauma and how that might be expressed, mental health and physical health, and how those are so connected, but folks might have different ways of expressing that. Might be difficult for a doctor to understand if there isn't the either adequate language or cultural understanding.
Now, can you elaborate on the role of Indigenous traditions and health practices in the work of your organization, especially in the light of historical experiences of medical violence and the challenges posed by the COVID-19 crisis?
So the COVID-19 crisis definitely created a big challenge for us in terms of misinformation that was being spread about the virus, about what it meant to be infected, about vaccines. So there was a lot of effort for community members to become vaccinated and really pushing the right information in the languages that people speak. So there was a lot of work done to record videos of people talking about COVID-19 in Indigenous languages and really sharing that to spread accurate information. There's also a lot of sharing that happened around traditional remedies. So that was either teas that people were drinking or other ways that they felt they were feeling better that they wanted to share. So that was either happening in our different channels that we have, but really bringing about that awareness of like what that could mean for individuals, not necessarily practicing in sort of Western medicine, but other ways of knowing and of feeling in their bodies, all right? So that health piece was really important, and finding different ways of addressing the pandemic.
Now, can you just share any success stories or impactful moments from your work with the organization that highlights the positive changes and progress you've witnessed within Indigenous immigrant communities in NYC?
It's gonna take me a minute.
Yeah, it's okay. I know you mentioned that it's pretty new to you. I guess I could frame it as in, what do you hope to see, since this is kind of like a new journey for you, what do you hope to see for the future of the work that you're doing here in this organization, especially for these communities in New York City?
I think always at this work, you want it to still be rooted in the community. So trying to find ways that to continue to empower the community to learn about these processes. I think I can come in and share my knowledge information, but it really is important for folks to know how to access these things on their own, for themselves, how to advocate for themselves. I think that's something that's really important. And we're seeing that every day in our community, but really making sure that we're honoring those ways of knowledge and of communicating, and so really trying to find ways to keep pushing that forward and really being able to share my expertise, but also continuing to learn from the community members so that we can continue to strengthen our organization.
And what can people do if they want to get more involved? And let's say, they are from this community and they're like, you know what, I could be doing so much more for my community. What could they do to simply just start to learn more or even get involved?
Always come visit us in the Bronx. So we are very identifiable because we have a brand new mural on our street, but we have events that are happening pretty much every day. So we have a music class, we have an embroidery class, different arts classes. And we also have our upcoming New York Land event, which is happening in October. That is our annual celebration where we bring folks together to celebrate in food and in artwork and in language. We also bring folks from Mexico or other countries to share in those traditions. So we'll invite folks to come and bring their expertise to us and share it with the community. So we're always having events for the community. We also do a lot of work around health access, so bringing health fairs and health information to the members. So there's always something happening if folks want to get involved. I think it's really continuing to grow as folks do learn more about us, which is really exciting, and wanting to make sure that people can access that information.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation with us. And I also love that it's not all paperwork. There's some fun stuff. There's a lot of arts and food. So thank you so much for joining us and just kind of sharing a little bit more about your organization.
Thank you so much.